All right. This is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 15, the Civil War, 1860 to 1865. We'll be looking at Section 1, the origins and outbreak of the Civil War. So recall that in the last chapter, we had talked about the ever important 1860 election. In that presidential election, Abraham Lincoln, who was the Republican, recall the Republican Party was a newer party created as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It was explicitly a party of the North that was opposed to the expansion of slavery. Now, Abraham Lincoln won this election, winning pretty much only the states where slavery was illegal. So only the free states voted for him, but that was enough to win the electoral victory. This prompted then South Carolina, this became kind of the last straw, to leave the Union or to secede. South Carolina was the first. It voted unanimously to leave the Union, but was soon followed up by, we might say, followed by 6 other southern states. So in total, if my memory serves me correctly, there were 7 states to originally leave the Union. Now, the election of Abraham Lincoln was not the cause of the Civil War as just an event alone, but was really the culmination of a number of different issues that had been leading up to that point, namely the expansion of slavery, or the expansion or the debate over the expansion of slavery, specifically in the West. And we can go back decades and trace the arguments between Northerners and Southerners, particularly over this issue, beginning with Missouri and the Missouri Compromise in the 1820s. Then there was the debate over the annexation of Texas. Adding Texas to the Union would make it the largest slave state. Northerners objected to it. Southerners supported it. Finally, in 1845, it became part of the United States. Then there was the debate over the Mexican Cession. That was the territory acquired by Mexico from the Mexican-American War. So land, we'll say, won by the U.S. in the Mexican War. And again, the debate was, for Northerners, should this land be free? For Southerners, should this land have slavery legal in it? Finally, what solved the issue was the Compromise of 1850. Then you had the whole situation in Kansas with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the popularity or the emergence of this notion of popular sovereignty, which is just to let people vote on it, which was seen as sort of a way to solve the constant debates that were going on in Congress. Again, these were all congressional debates between Northerners and Southerners, Northerners wanting these territories to be free, Southerners wanting them to be, slave territories. And then popular sovereignty was hopefully an answer to this solution, rather than having Congress be deadlocked and argue over this, where Northerners and Southerners were not going to see eye to eye. Just let the people vote. And so they tried that in Kansas. And what happened is that all the pro-slavery people and all the anti-slavery people went to Kansas to support their side, and it resulted in Bleeding Kansas, which was, the explicit violence there. Bleeding Kansas, sometimes referred to as the Civil War before the Civil War. So, the expansion of slavery in a lot of ways was the, focal point for this growing division between North and South. And ultimately, Abraham Lincoln's election was sort of, the straw that broke the camel's back. It was the last straw. There was also the growing concern of Northerners against the institution of slavery, not just in the Western territories, but, the abolitionist movement that, started around, the 1830s through the 1860s, which became more and more vocal. Abolitionists also put their efforts into various political parties, the Liberty Party, the Free Soil Party, the Republican Party. I mean, these were all parties, all political parties, political parties that were centered, their entire focus was on slavery. So it became, as the decades went on, this issue of slavery became a much more bigger concern for Americans. Now, even at the point of South Carolina seceding from the Union, there was one last ditch effort to create some sort of solution, and that was the Crittenden Compromise. So we'll call this the last ditch effort to bring the country back together. It was written by, I believe, Senator Crittenden from Kentucky. And essentially what he proposed was a re-employing of the Missouri Compromise line. So you can actually see it on this map. He suggested making this the line for which slavery would be legal and illegal. That would overturn the Compromise of 1850. So if we look at California, which had been admitted as a free state, it would potentially open up this area to slavery, but would also guarantee free soil above this line. It was rejected by both the North and the South. We can say rejected by both North and South. At this point, it was too late. For Northerners, Lincoln explicitly stated that he was elected to prevent slavery from expanding westward, so no compromise that did that would be acceptable. Southerners were referencing the Dred Scott decision, saying they essentially would, take their enslaved property wherever they felt like it, that they would not be prohibited by this line. So the 7 deep southern states, South Carolina, see if we can get these here. South Carolina, Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, and Texas are your first 7. Agreed to meet to create a loose confederation, ultimately known as the CSA, the Confederate States of America, or simply just the Confederacy. A confederacy is sort of a loose government. They created a constitution for these 7 states. Ultimately, there would be more states that eventually joined the Confederacy. The Constitution was modeled very closely on the United States Constitution. Its government was very, very similar. The CSA, or the Confederate States of America, had 3 branches of government, an executive, legislative, and judicial, just like the American Constitution. But one key difference was that the Confederate States of America, or the Constitution, explicitly defended slavery. So we might say a constitutional protection. Not even a protection. I would say, I'm just going to leave it as protection, but you could write guarantee, right? It was a constitutional guarantee of slavery, right? Of slavery. As their president, the Confederacy chose Jefferson Davis. He was the president of the Confederate States, or the CSA. And Alexander Stephens was chosen as the vice president. Jefferson Davis was from Mississippi. Alexander Stephens was from Georgia. And both of them, especially Jefferson Davis, they weren't the most rabid of secessionists. They were pretty well respected at the time, I would say, before secession, obviously. And they were chosen mainly as an effort to try to pull in some of those other southern states that hadn't quite decided. Recall that at this point, the count of states having seceded is still 7. So there's a lot of states that are kind of up in the air, so to speak. A lot of what motivated the Confederacy's choice of president and vice president had to do with persuading those 7 or those other states. Same goes for the time that Lincoln finally came into office. So all of this, right, the fact that 7 states had seceded, that they had created their own constitution, effectively declaring themselves independent from the United States. This was even before Lincoln set foot in office. And for the most part, the previous president, James Buchanan, he couldn't get out, of the White House fast enough. So Lincoln had this huge mess by the time that he entered into office. And so when he gave his inauguration speech, the speech that all presidents give once they assume the White House, he was also looking to sort of mend the nation in a lot of ways. He was speaking both to the southern states that seceded, but he was also speaking to the other states in which slavery was illegal, like Virginia, that had not yet decided on what to do. And in his inauguration address, more or less did 2 things. One is that he gave a guarantee that slavery would not be interfered where it existed. So we might say Lincoln's inauguration on the issue of slavery, Lincoln stated he had no intention of ending slavery where it existed. And hopefully that would sort of quell some of the fears by those other states in which slavery was legal to break off as well. Although, at the same time, Lincoln was committed to preventing the further expansion of it, would not allow for it to expand. At the same time, Lincoln said of secession that it was not constitutional. So, the Confederate States of America, or the CSA, although people in the South and supporters of the Confederacy would claim that they broke away from the United States, Lincoln never officially recognized that, never recognized the CSA as a separate entity. Instead, he referred to the southern states are in rebellion. Right? They're simply rebelling against the United States, but they can't actually leave the United States because that's unconstitutional, right? It's not legal, cannot legally happen. Although, of course, supporters of secession would say that they had the legal right to do that. So during the whole Civil War, this is Lincoln's view. The southern states are in rebellion. They didn't actually break away. Yet still, there was some effort by Lincoln and others that there could be some reconciliation. That changed with the events at Fort Sumter, which are considered to be the first shots fired in the Civil War. So what was happening in the states that had seceded, first I'll go and mention that Fort Sumter occurred in Charleston, South Carolina. It occurred on April 12th, 1861. Fort Sumter was a federal fort fired upon by South Carolina militia. Here you can see an image of Fort Sumter being bombarded. But essentially what was going on in the southern states during secession was that, within each respective state, we'll just say that, I don't know, it looks a little bit like Georgia or something like that. There are federal bases, right, military bases that don't necessarily belong to the state of Georgia. Most of these bases willingly surrendered once states seceded. Most people who were stationed there were sympathizers with the Confederate cause. Fort Sumter was different. It was in South Carolina. The general there, I think general, officer, whatever his title was, refused to surrender. And South Carolina had cut off the fort from any sort of outside supplies. Lincoln made a very conscious decision not to start the war himself, and eventually the South Carolina militia opened fire on Fort Sumter, It was at that point that Abraham Lincoln called up volunteers for what was expected to be a quick and short conflict that turned out to be the opposite of the case. Meanwhile, Fort Sumter also was the event that really pushed many of the other states to pick a side, right? The fact that Abraham Lincoln was calling for troops, it was clear that some sort of battle or your war was on the horizon. So states that were undecided had to choose. And so many of the upper South states, or I shouldn't say many, but some of the upper South states, including Virginia, others like Tennessee, Arkansas, North Carolina. I think those are the meaningful ones. All decided to go for the South or for the Confederacy. Virginia was a big one because Virginia was, there was a lot of history in Virginia. It was part of the Virginia dynasty. Many presidents had come from there. It was a state that bordered the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. But even in a place like Virginia, there were parts that were not fully supportive of joining the Confederate cause. Part of Virginia broke away, became a different state called West Virginia, and supported the Union. So we're going to say broke away from Virginia to support the North, right? The North. And we'll use these terms interchangeably. If you're not familiar with them, it's good to be familiar with them now. But in terms of the sides of the Civil War, the Union, actually, let's make this easier to follow. Let's do it in blue because the Union wore blue uniforms. The Union refers to the North. And let's do this in, I was going to say gray, but we can do it with the red. And the Confederacy is the South. So these terms will be used interchangeably: Union, Confederacy, North, South. So, North versus South, Union versus Confederacy, same difference. Fort Sumter also made it so not only states had to choose which side they wanted to go on, but also people. Probably the most famous example is that of Robert E. Lee, who was considered to be one of the best generals in the United States at the time, offered by Abraham Lincoln a position in the Union Army, decided to join the Confederacy instead because of his home state of Virginia, who decided to go with the Confederacy. So joined the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee did. That is to say that in choosing sides, there were some that were very clearly for the Union, some that were very clearly for the Confederacy, but they were a couple of very important and particular cases, and we call these the border states, right? The border states. Now, a border state is a state where slavery is legal, but it fights for the side of the Union. Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky. Right? Again, these are what we consider to be the border states. So again, a border state is a state in which slavery is legal, but that state fights for the side of the North or the Union.